Ah, hello again, traveller. Welcome back. There is always a seat for you here, by the warmth of the hearth. It is good to see this place, this small corner of quiet in a noisy world, growing with each story we share. Before we begin our tale tonight, a small thought: if you find solace in this warmth, a quiet nod of appreciation, what your world calls a Phytonleica, does much to keep this fire burning brightly, helping other weary souls find their way to it through the dark. And if you wish to join our circle permanently, to be called when the next story is ready to be told, consider adding your name to our fellowship. They call it subscribing *. The stories shared here are but echoes of the past, but your own thoughts, your reflections in the comments, below, add new voices to the firelight. They are all welcome. Now, with our fellowship gathered, let us turn our gaze back in time, further back than our last journey, but to a world still bearing its scars. The year is 1346. A generation has passed since the Great Famine. The memory of the endless rain has faded into a tale that grandparents tell to frighten children. The world has healed, or so it seems. Europe is once again teeming with life. It is a continent that is crowded, connected, and confident. The population has rebounded with a fierce vitality, filling the cities until they burst at the seams, and pushing into the countryside with a renewed hunger for land and prosperity. The roads are alive again, lines of merchants' carts, their wheels groaning under the weight of Flemish wool and Italian silk, trace dusty paths across the landscape. Pilgrims, their faces etched with faith, walk the long roads to Rome or Santiago de Compostela. In the ports of Venice, Genoa and Marseille, a forest of masts sways gently in the harbour. These ships are the continent's lifeblood, carrying wine, grain, spices and ideas from one end of the known world to the other. They are the arteries of a vibrant and interconnected civilization. This is a world that believes in order. The church bells mark the hours with unwavering certainty, a reminder of God's dominion over time itself. The great cathedrals, miracles of stone and glass, soar towards the heavens, a testament to a faith that feels as solid and eternal as the stone from which they are built. The king is on his throne, the lord is in his castle, and the peasant is in his field. Life is hard, of course. It is often short and brutal, but it has a rhythm, a logic. They believe they understand their world, its perils and its promises, but what they do not see, what they cannot possibly comprehend, is the fragility of it all. Their world, for all its stone castles and soaring cathedrals, is built on a knife's edge. The cities are a labyrinth of narrow, filthy streets, where people live packed together, sharing their space not just with each other, but with rats and fleas and 1,000 other unseen companions. Their knowledge of medicine is a tapestry of superstition, prayer, and frighteningly misguided theories. And along those very same arteries of life, the trade routes from the far and exotic east, something else is traveling. It is an unseen passenger, hiding in the fur of marmots on the vast plains of Asia, carried by the fleas that feed on them, and then by the black rats that infest the caravans and the cargo holds of ships. It is a traveler far more patient and far more deadly than any army. As the year 1346 draws to a close, the people of Europe look to the future with a sense of cautious optimism. They have survived famine, they have survived war, they believe they know their enemies, they can see the soldier with his sword, the lord with his taxes, but they cannot see the real threat. An enemy so small it is invisible, so vast it would swallow their world whole. It is coming, and it will be known as the Black Death. Our story does not begin in the crowded streets of Europe. It begins in silence, a vast, profound silence that blankets the endless grasslands of the Central Asian steppe. This is a world of immense horizons, where the sky is a brutal, brilliant blue, and the earth is a sea of waving grass that stretches from one end of the world to the other. It is a land of nomads, of horsemen, of empires that rise and fall like the dust storms that sweep across the plains. And it is here, in this ancient and unforgiving landscape, that our enemy has slept for centuries. It is not a monster of myth. It is a living thing, infinitesimally small, a bacterium, Yersinia pestis, Asterisk. For time immemorial, it has existed in a quiet, stable cycle, a secret shared between the wild marmots that burrow beneath the grass and the fleas that feed upon their blood. The marmots, a kind of stout, social ground squirrel, are its natural reservoir. The bacterium lives within them, sometimes causing small outbreaks that kill a colony, but never enough to threaten the species as a whole. The fleas are its vessel, its ship, carrying the pestilence from one host to another. For thousands of years, this cycle of life and death played out, unknown and unnoticed by the world of men. It was a sleeping dragon. Sometime in the 1330s, something changed. Perhaps it was a shift in the climate, a series of unusually wet springs followed by hot, dry summers that caused the marmot population to boom and then to crash. Perhaps it was the expansion of human activity as caravans pushed deeper into the remote grasslands, their paths intersecting with these invisible pockets of disease. Or perhaps it was simply chance, the spark that ignites the forest fire. A hunter, seeking the marmots for their valuable fur, handles an infected animal. A flea, its rodent host now dead, makes a desperate leap to a new source of warmth and blood, a passing human. A family of nomads, camping near a dying marmot colony, is visited in the night by these tiny, thirsty assassins. The first human victim would have felt it as a sudden fever, a violent chill that racked their body. A profound weakness would have set in, a weariness that went straight to the bone. And then the sign, the terrible telltale sign. In the groin, the armpit, or on the neck, a swelling would appear. A lymph node, overwhelmed by the bacterial invasion, would begin to grow, hardening into a painful egg-sized lump. This was the bubo, the namesake of the bubonic plague. From there, the bacteria would pour into the bloodstream, turning the skin dark with internal bleeding, giving the plague its most famous and fearsome name, the Black Death. For these first unlucky souls, death would have been a swift and agonizing affair, a bewildering storm that swept them away in a matter of days. Their families, tending to them in their final moments, would have been the next to fall. A single death becomes a family tragedy. A family tragedy becomes a village's horror. And a village's horror, when placed upon the world's most extensive highway, becomes a global catastrophe. This highway was the Silk Road. It was not a single road, but a sprawling network of arteries and veins, a web of paths and passages that connected the empires of the East with the kingdoms of the West. It was the conduit of civilization itself. Along its dusty tracks traveled silk, spices, porcelain, and jewels, but it also carried ideas, religions, languages, and stories. It was a place of immense wealth and vibrant exchange, a river of humanity flowing across the vastness of Asia. And now, it had a new cargo. Imagine a caravan, a long line of camels and merchants, moving slowly through the shimmering heat of the desert. They stop at a caravanserai, a roadside inn, to rest and trade. They do not know that the merchant they just shared a meal with is incubating the plague. They do not see the rats, the common black rats that infest every human settlement, scurrying aboard their carts, hiding amongst the silks and spices. They do not feel the fleas that leap from the rats to their own clothes, their own bodies. When the caravan moves on, it carries more than just goods, it carries death. The plague began its slow, inexorable march westward. It crept into the great trading cities of the Mongol Empire. It struck Tabriz, a jewel of Persia, famed for its markets. It reached Baghdad, a shadow of its former glory, but still a vital hub. From these centers, it radiated outwards, following every path a human or a rat could travel. Whispers began to reach Europe, fragmented, unreliable tales from Venetian and Genoese merchants returning from the east. They spoke of a terrifying pestilence in the distant land of Cathay, or China, a disease that could depopulate entire cities, that left no survivors. They said that in India, the land was covered in the dead, but these were seen as fables, the kind of exaggerated stories that travelers always bring back from faraway lands. Europe listened, but it did not tremble. The stories were too distant, too fantastical. It was someone else's problem, but the enemy was getting closer. The Mongol Empire, known in Europe as the Golden Horde, was a dominant power, controlling the vast territories north of the Black Sea. Their armies were a relentless force, and they too became carriers of the plague. In 1346, a Mongol army under the command of Jani Beg laid siege to the city of Kaffa, a thriving trading outpost on the Crimean Peninsula. Kaffa was a Genoese colony, a vital link in their trade network, a European window onto the Black Sea. The siege dragged on, but then the besiegers themselves began to fall ill. A mysterious and horrifying disease swept through the Mongol camp, killing thousands, turning their mighty army into a sea of groaning, dying men. Their strength was broken, their siege was failing. But in an act of military desperation that would change the course of history, Jani Beg decided to give his enemy the very weapon that was destroying him. He ordered his men to load the corpses of the plague victims onto their giant catapults, and so the dead began to rain down from the sky. They arced over the high stone walls of Kaffa, landing with a sickening thud in the streets and squares of the terrified city. The Genoese defenders, horrified, quickly dragged the bodies back to the walls and threw them into the sea. But it was too late. The air was tainted. The rats were already inside. The dragon had breached the gate. The plague was now inside Europe. The siege collapsed, and the panicked Genoese traders fled for their lives. They scrambled aboard their galleys, hoisting their sails, desperate to escape the dying city. They did not know, as they sailed west across the Black Sea, towards the heart of their own world, that they were not escaping the pestilence. They were carrying it with them. They were the harbingers of the apocalypse. In October of 1347, the watchman on the sun-drenched walls of Messina, a bustling port city on the northeastern tip of Sicily, saw a familiar and welcome sight. A squadron of 12 Genoese trading galleys was making its way towards the harbour. Their silhouettes were unmistakable, their journey a common one. For the people of Messina, these ships meant goods, news, and the continued hum of commerce that was the city's very lifeblood. A crowd would have begun to gather at the docks, a mix of merchants eager to see their investments return, stevedores ready for work, and curious children drawn to the spectacle of the great ships. But as the galleys drew closer, a strange disquiet settled over the harbour. Something was wrong. The usual sounds of a ship returning to port were absent. There were no sailors scrambling in the rigging to furl the sails, no cheerful shouts from the deck, no captain barking orders. The ships moved with an eerie, ghost-like silence, drifting towards the docks as if steered by an unseen hand. They were not ships returning from a prosperous voyage. They were floating tombs. When the first galley bumped against the pier, the silence was deafening. The port officials, perhaps a magistrate, and a handful of guards, would have hailed the ship, their calls echoing unanswered across the water. Frowning, their sense of unease turning to suspicion, they would have cautiously boarded the vessel. What they found would have seared itself into their minds for the rest of their short lives. The deck was a scene from a nightmare. The sailors who were still alive were spectres, their bodies racked with fever, delirious with pain, their voices too weak to even cry out. Many more were already dead, slumped over their oars, or lying where they had fallen. And all of them, the living and the dead, bore the same horrifying marks, dark, angry swellings in their armpits and groins, many of which had burst and oozed a foul-smelling black pus. Their skin was mottled with dark patches, the black spots that gave the disease its terrible name. The air was thick with the stench of sickness, decay, and death. The magistrate would have recoiled in horror, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. This was no known illness. It was a hellish affliction, a punishment from God made manifest. His first instinct, and the instinct of the city's leaders, was one of self-preservation. They had to contain this horror. They made a swift, logical, and ultimately futile decision. The ships were to be denied entry. They were to be cast out. With long poles, the dock workers pushed the ghost ships away from the piers. They fired flaming arrows into their sails, hoping to drive them back out to the open sea. The people of Messina, now a terrified mob, hurled stones and curses at the dying men aboard, seeing them not as fellow Christians, but as carriers of a demonic pestilence. The 12 galleys, now truly damned, drifted away from the port, their cargo of nightmares left to wander the Mediterranean. But it was too late. The invisible invasion had already taken place. In the brief time the ships were docked, as the crowd gathered and the officials went aboard, the plague had disembarked. The true carriers were not the dying sailors. They were the rats. Black rats, nimble and quick, that scurried down the thick mooring ropes and vanished into the city's labyrinth of warehouses, cellars and sewers. And on those rats were the fleas, the tiny bloodthirsty vessels of Yersinia pestis, which now found themselves in a new world teeming with warm-blooded hosts. Within days, the horror that had been confined to the ships began to bloom within the city walls. A stevedore who had helped tie the first mooring rope developed a fever. A merchant's wife who had been watching from the docks found a painful swelling in her groin. A priest who had rushed to the pier to offer last rites was soon in need of them himself. The disease exploded through Messina with a speed and ferocity that defied all understanding. It was as if an invisible fire was consuming the city, leaping from house to house, from street to street, with terrifying randomness. The social fabric of the city disintegrated almost overnight. The rich and the healthy, seeing the futility of prayer and the helplessness of medicine, did the only thing they could: they fled. They packed their belongings and streamed out of the city gates, hoping to find refuge in the countryside or in other towns. In their panicked flight, they unwittingly became the new emissaries of the plague, carrying the disease with them, seeding it in the fertile soil of an unsuspecting Sicily. Those left behind in Messina descended into a living hell. The sick were abandoned, family members locked their doors on their own kin, doctors refused to see patients, priests themselves dying in droves could no longer offer comfort or burial. The dead lay in the streets where they fell, their bodies swelling in the autumn sun. The city, just weeks before a thriving hub of life and commerce, became a ghost town, its silence broken only by the wails of the dying and the frantic tolling of a few remaining church bells. The gateway to Europe had been breached. The plague was now loose on the continent. From the toe of Italy, it began its relentless, terrifying march northward, following the very same paths of trade and pilgrimage that had once been the continent's pride. The arteries of life were now the arteries of death, and an entire world held its breath, waiting for the footsteps of the silent, invisible enemy that had just arrived at its gates. As the plague began its relentless crawl up the Italian peninsula and into the heart of France, a second parallel pestilence took hold. It was not a sickness of the body, but of the mind. It was born from a single, agonizing question that echoed in every city, every village, every household touched by the shadow of the disease. Why? Why was this happening? How did this affliction travel? What was this invisible enemy that could fell the strongest knight as easily as the frailest child, the holiest priest as swiftly as the most venal sinner? In a world without the concept of germs, without microscopes to reveal the tiny assassins in their midst, the search for an answer was a desperate, stumbling journey through a landscape of faith, fear, and fantasy. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, and so they fought shadows of their own making. The first and most powerful explanation was found not on earth, but in heaven. This was God's judgment. The great pestilence was nothing less than the wrath of the Almighty, poured out upon a sinful and corrupt world. Priests thundered from the pulpits that this was the wages of humanity's pride, its greed, its vanity, and its decadence. They pointed to the famines and wars of recent years as mere tremors before the great earthquake of God's fury. This belief settled like a shroud over Europe. It meant that the plague was not just a medical crisis, but a spiritual one. The enemy was not a disease, it was sin itself. The enemy was within every man, woman, and child. This created a profound and paralyzing sense of collective guilt, a belief that they had brought this apocalypse upon themselves. But for the learned men of the universities, the physicians and scholars, a divine explanation was not enough. They sought a natural cause, a rational mechanism for the contagion. Their gaze turned to the air itself. The dominant medical theory of the age was the doctrine of miasma. They believed that disease was carried on corrupted or pestilential air, a foul vapor that rose from decaying organic matter, from swamps, from cesspits, from unburied corpses, from the filth of the overcrowded cities. This miasma, they theorized, could also be generated by terrifying cosmic events. The scholars at the University of Paris, commissioned by the King of France to explain the plague, produced a sober and detailed report. They looked to the heavens for their answer. They wrote of the great conjunction of three planets, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, in the sign of Aquarius in the year 1345. This powerful celestial alignment, they concluded, had drawn up evil vapors from the earth and seas, creating a poisoned atmosphere that now drifted across the world, killing all it touched. To the medieval mind, this was not superstition, it was science. It was an attempt to find order in the chaos, to explain the seemingly random nature of the disease through the predictable and majestic movements of the cosmos. This belief in miasma dictated their desperate and largely useless attempts at public health. If the air was the enemy, then the air must be purified. Great bonfires of aromatic woods like pine and rosemary were lit in the streets of cities like Paris, their fragrant smoke intended to drive away the pestilence. People were advised to carry posies of flowers or pouches of herbs, what would one day become the pocket full of posies of the nursery rhyme, holding them to their noses whenever they went out. They burned incense in their homes. They rang church bells loudly in the belief that the vibrations could break up the poisoned air, and they sealed their windows and doors, hoping to keep the deadly vapors out. They were fighting the smell of death, believing it was death itself. When God and the stars offered no relief, the human heart, in its terror, sought a more tangible enemy. Fear, left to fester, curdles into hatred. And so the third great explanation was born: conspiracy. The enemy was not in the heavens or in the air, but amongst them, walking in their midst. Whispers turned to accusations, and accusations turned to violence. The most vulnerable and ancient scapegoat in Europe became the target: the Jewish communities. Horrific, baseless rumors began to spread like the plague itself. It was said that the Jews, in a vast international conspiracy, were poisoning the wells and springs of Christendom, hoping to destroy it from within. This theory, born of pure malice and ignorance, offered a simple, satisfying, and monstrous answer to the people's suffering. It gave them someone to blame, someone to punish. Across Europe, from Switzerland and Germany to France and Spain, a wave of brutal pogroms was unleashed. Entire Jewish communities were rounded up and massacred. Thousands were burned alive, their pleas of innocence drowned out by the roar of the mob. It did not matter that Jewish people were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians. It did not matter that the Pope himself issued edicts declaring their innocence. In a world gone mad with fear, the hunt for a scapegoat was a fever that could not be broken. So they looked to the heavens, to the air, and to their neighbors for the cause of their suffering. They blamed sin, and planets, and poison, and all the while, the true culprit moved among them, utterly ignored. No one blamed the rats that scurried through their homes, a common and unremarkable feature of daily life. No one suspected the fleas, the tiny specks of life that leaped from person to person, from cloth to bedding. The enemy was not a grand cosmic event or a diabolical conspiracy. It was a biological mechanism, simple, efficient, and horrifyingly mundane. They were fighting a war on a dozen fronts, all of them imaginary, while the real enemy marched through their gates, past their feet and into their beds, completely unseen. In the midst of this whirlwind of fear, prayer, and blame, a new figure began to walk the deserted streets of Europe. He was not a priest, nor a soldier, nor a king. He was a man of medicine, or what passed for it, and his very appearance was a symbol of the strange and terrifying new reality. His silhouette became one of the most enduring and nightmarish images of the Black Death, the Plague Doctor. To see him arrive in your town was a moment of both desperate hope and profound dread. It meant that the municipal council, wealthy patrons, or even the Pope himself had acknowledged the catastrophe and had hired an expert. But it also meant that the plague was well and truly among you, that the shadow had fallen over your home. The doctor was not a cure, but a confirmation of the disease. Let us dispel the myth at once. These were rarely the most esteemed or successful physicians of the age. The truly wealthy and established doctors, who tended to kings and cardinals, often did what the rest of the rich did: they fled. The men who took on the role of plague doctor were often a different breed. Some were young, ambitious physicians, unable to establish a practice, and seeing this as a grim but powerful opportunity to make a name for themselves. Others were second-rate practitioners, unable to compete in normal times, and some, undoubtedly, were outright charlatans, preying on the terror of the populace for a high wage. But whoever they were, they shared one thing in common: a degree of courage, or perhaps desperation, that bordered on madness. For a handsome fee paid by the city, they agreed to stay. They agreed to walk into the homes that everyone else was fleeing. They agreed to touch the sick, to breathe the air of the dying, and to look death in the face, day after agonizing day. And to face this monstrous enemy, they donned a monstrous uniform. Picture him, a walking fortress against a phantom foe. At its heart was the mask, a terrifying bird-like visage with a long curved beak, its eye holes fitted with glass spectacles. This was not designed for pure terror, but was a direct application of the miasma theory. The beak was a respirator, a hollow chamber stuffed with a potent cocktail of aromatic herbs and spices: mint, cloves, camphor, myrrh, and rose petals. The doctor would breathe only this perfumed, purified air, believing it would filter out the pestilence. It was a primitive, personal gas mask against a misunderstood enemy. His body was shrouded in a long, heavy coat of waxed leather, stretching from neck to ankle. Gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, all made of the same material, completed the ensemble. The theory was that the waxed surface would be impervious to the deadly miasma, preventing it from clinging to his person. Finally, he carried a long wooden staff. This was a crucial tool. It allowed him to examine patients, to push them, to lift their bedclothes, and even to take their pulse without ever making direct skin-to-skin contact. It was also on occasion used to fend off the desperate, terrified crowds who might mob him for a miracle cure. And what were those cures? They were a tragic testament to the profound ignorance of the age. Armed with his staff and his strange costume, the plague doctor would enter a home and perform his grim duties. His primary goal was to treat the buboes, the painful swellings that were the plague's signature. He might apply a poultice made of figs, onions, and boiled butter, hoping to draw out the poison. More often, he would perform the terrifying act of lancing the bubo with a sharp knife, a procedure of excruciating pain that, by opening a wound in a body already fighting for its life, likely hastened death far more often than it prevented it. Bloodletting was another common practice. Believing the body's health depended on the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, they thought the plague created an excess of blood. They would open a vein, draining precious blood from a patient already weakened by fever and internal bleeding, pushing them closer to the edge. They prescribed potions of crushed emeralds, of arsenic and mercury, or bizarre concoctions of 10-year-old molasses. They were throwing stones in the dark, hoping one might hit the invisible beast. But the doctor's role was more than just medical. In a world abandoned by so many, he was often the last official to witness a life. He became a record keeper, a counter of the dead, his presence required to witness wills and testaments. He was a figure of immense authority, able to order quarantines and condemn buildings, yet he was also an outcast. He was often forbidden from interacting with the healthy population and lived in a state of perpetual isolation. He was both a savior and a pariah, a beacon of hope and a harbinger of doom. Imagine the psychological toll, to spend every waking hour immersed in death, surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of unimaginable suffering. To know that your best efforts, your most advanced medical knowledge, were utterly useless. To watch entire families wither and die before your eyes, and then to walk, alone, through the silent streets to the next house, the next victim. These men, whatever their initial motivations, became priests of a dark and mysterious science, their faith not in God, but in a desperate, flawed and profoundly human attempt to impose order on absolute chaos. The plague did not just wage war on the human body, it waged war on the human heart. It was a solvent that dissolved the sacred bonds of trust and love that hold a society together. As the pestilence swept across the land, it left in its wake not just corpses, but an abandoned world. A world where the most fundamental duties, of parent to child, of neighbor to neighbor, of priest to flock, were rendered impossible by a terror that was stronger than love itself. This breakdown began in the home. The family, the very bedrock of medieval life, became the primary vessel of contagion and the stage for the most heartbreaking tragedies. When the first member of a household fell ill, a terrible choice had to be made. To stay and care for the sick was to almost certainly condemn oneself to the same agonizing death. To flee was to abandon a loved one in their final terrifying hours. It was a choice that ripped families apart. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, described this collapse with horrified clarity. He wrote, "This terror was of so pitiable a nature that brother forsook brother, uncle his nephew, sister her brother, and oftentimes wife her husband. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate, as if they had been strangers." Imagine the scene. A mother, hearing the fevered moans of her child from the next room, torn between the primal instinct to comfort her baby and the paralyzing fear for her own life and the lives of her other children. She might push a piece of bread and a cup of water through a cracked door before sealing it shut, her heart breaking with every sob she heard from within. Imagine a husband watching his wife develop the dreaded bubo, locking her in their home and fleeing into the night, haunted forever by her cries. This was not a failure of love, but a testament to the sheer, overwhelming power of the plague's terror. It forced good people to make monstrous choices. This abandonment echoed through every level of society. As the plague intensified, the villages and towns became places of profound isolation. Distant neighbors, who once shared bread and gossip over a common fence, now viewed each other with suspicion and fear. A cough from the house next door could send a family into a panic. The streets, once conduits of community life, fell silent. People scurried from place to place, their heads down, clutching their posies of herbs, avoiding the gaze of others, as if eye contact itself could transmit the disease. The very rituals that give structure to life and death collapsed. There were no more solemn funeral processions, no more tearful vigils. At first, the dead were buried in consecrated ground, but the cemeteries quickly filled. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts of towns, vast gaping pits into which corpses were thrown day and night, layered like lasagna, as one chronicler grimly put it, with thin coverings of earth between them. There were not enough priests to say the last rites, not enough men left to dig the graves, not enough wood to build the coffins. The dead were stripped of their final dignity, their passing unmarked and unmourned. In some places, entire communities chose to sacrifice themselves in a desperate attempt to contain the contagion. The story of Iam, a small village in Derbyshire, England, is a famous, though later, example of this extraordinary phenomenon. When the plague arrived in the village via a parcel of cloth from London, the villagers, led by their rector, made the heroic and terrible decision to quarantine themselves completely. They would allow no one to leave, ensuring the disease would die with them and not spread to the surrounding countryside. For over a year they endured their fate, burying their own dead in the fields, their community slowly withering away until the plague had burned itself out. They saved the region, but at the cost of their own world. The authorities, where they had not already fled or died, tried to impose order. They enacted quarantine laws, locking the sick and their entire families into their homes for 40 days. A quarantina, a period from which few emerged alive. Guards were posted outside the doors of the infected, turning the homes into inescapable prisons. But these measures were often brutal and ineffective. The wealthy could bribe their way out, while the desperate poor would try to escape, spreading the disease further. The world was turned upside down, the law courts ceased to function, the universities closed their doors, the fields lay fallow, as there was no one left to plough them. Livestock roamed untended, wandering through the empty streets of deserted villages. It was as if humanity was vanishing from the face of the earth, leaving behind a silent, overgrown and abandoned world. The poet Petrarch, writing from Italy, captured the profound sense of desolation. "Where are our dear friends now?" he asked. "What region of the earth, what shore has gathered them? What has a single year scattered and stolen from us? We are now almost alone." In a world where the hand of God seemed to be striking down humanity with indiscriminate fury, faith did not die. It mutated. It grew feverish, intensified, and twisted into extreme and desperate forms. The church, the great monolithic pillar of medieval life, was shaken to its very foundations. Its priests were dying in numbers even greater than the general populace, as their duties brought them into constant contact with the sick. Its rituals seemed powerless. Its promise of a divine, ordered universe lay in tatters. For millions, the only possible response was to cry out to God with a new, terrifying intensity. The most common response was a surge in conventional piety. Churches that still had priests were filled with terrified worshippers. People prayed with a fervor they had never known, their voices raw with desperation. They donated their lands and fortunes to the church, hoping to buy favor with a wrathful God. They embarked on pilgrimages to holy shrines, a desperate act that often only served to spread the pestilence further along the crowded pilgrim routes. The cult of saints exploded, particularly the veneration of Saint Roche, who was said to have miraculously survived the plague, and Saint Sebastian, an early Christian martyr often depicted pierced with arrows, which came to symbolize the sudden piercing pains of the plague. But for many, this conventional piety was not enough. If the sins of mankind were so great as to have brought about this apocalypse, then the penance had to be equally extreme. This belief gave birth to one of the most bizarre and shocking movements of the Middle Ages, the flagellants. They appeared as if from nowhere, a spontaneous eruption of collective religious hysteria. They were brotherhoods of men, and sometimes women, who roamed from town to town in solemn, disciplined processions. They marched barefoot, dressed in simple robes marked with a red cross, their faces hidden by hoods, and as they marched, they performed their terrible ritual. Upon arriving in a town square, they would form a great circle and begin their penance. They would strip to the waist, revealing backs already scarred and raw from previous rituals. Then, to the sound of mournful hymns, they would begin to scourge themselves and each other with heavy leather whips, tipped with sharp iron studs. For hours, they would lash their own bodies, the rhythmic thud of the whips mixing with their wails and prayers, turning the town square into a theater of blood and agony. They believed that by taking on this extreme physical suffering, by mortifying their own flesh, they were imitating the suffering of Christ and taking the sins of the world upon themselves. They were offering their own blood as a sacrifice to appease God's anger and end the plague. At first, the populace greeted the flagellants with awe and reverence. They were seen as living saints, holy men whose extreme devotion might actually work. The townspeople would flock to watch their rituals, dipping cloths in their blood to take home sacred relics. But the movement soon grew beyond the control of the church. The flagellant leaders began to preach a radical and dangerous message. They claimed they could forgive sins, a power reserved for priests alone. They began to attack the clergy, accusing them of corruption and greed. And most dangerously, their fanatical processions often became the trigger for the horrific pogroms against the Jewish communities, as they whipped their followers into a frenzy of blame and hatred. The Church, seeing its authority challenged, finally condemned the movement. In 1349, Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull declaring the flagellants heretical and ordering them to be suppressed. But by then the movement had largely burned itself out, its failure to stop the plague as evident as the scars on its followers' backs. While some sought salvation in pain, others sought it in hedonism. If the world was ending, if death was inescapable, why not enjoy the fleeting moments that remained? This was the carpe diem philosophy of the damned. Boccaccio described this phenomenon in Florence, writing of people who drank and revelled incessantly, visiting every tavern and indulging in every pleasure. They abandoned all restraint, all morality. They would break into the homes of the dead and dying, feasting on their food, drinking their wine, and dressing in their fine clothes, holding macabre parties while the city collapsed around them. It was a hysterical, defiant laugh in the face of the apocalypse, a frantic attempt to feel alive in a world saturated with death. The plague also gave rise to a new and pervasive artistic obsession. The theme of danse macabre or the dance of death, began to appear in frescoes, woodcuts, and poems across Europe. These were not celebrations of death, but grim reminders of its absolute power and its role as the great equalizer. In these images, skeletal figures representing death are shown leading a procession of mortals to their doom. They dance with popes, emperors, knights, merchants, and peasants alike. The message was clear and uncompromising. No matter your wealth, your power, or your piety, you cannot escape the dance. Death comes for everyone. This period of intense faith, fanaticism, and fear left a deep psychological scar on the European psyche. It eroded trust in established institutions, particularly the church, which had proven powerless. It created a world haunted by a new and intimate familiarity with death. But paradoxically, in the ashes of this spiritual crisis, the seeds of a new world were being sown. The old certainties had been shattered, leaving a void that would soon be filled by new ideas, new questions, and a new way of looking at humanity's place in the universe. When the first wave of the Great Pestilence finally receded around the year 1351, it left behind a profound and echoing silence. Europe was a ghost of its former self. A third, perhaps even half, of its people were gone. Fields lay fallow, villages stood empty, and cities that once teemed with life now had whole districts that were deserted and silent. The survivors walked through a world that was both familiar and terrifyingly new, a world haunted by the ghosts of everyone they had ever known. They had survived the apocalypse, and now they had to inherit the earth. This inheritance, born of unimaginable loss, would trigger the most profound social and economic revolution Europe had seen in 1,000 years. The very foundations of their world, the rigid structures of feudalism that had seemed so eternal, had been shattered, and it all began with a simple, undeniable fact: there were not enough people left to do the work. For centuries, the life of a peasant, a serf, was defined by his powerlessness. He was bound to the land, owned by his lord as surely as the trees and the soil. His labor was cheap, his life expendable. But now, in this new, empty world, everything had changed. The fundamental law of supply and demand had asserted itself with brutal force. Labor, once abundant, was now terrifyingly scarce. And because it was scarce, it was suddenly, powerfully, valuable. Imagine a surviving peasant. Let us call him William. Before the plague, he was one of 100 men working his lord's manor. Now he is one of perhaps 30. His lord, desperate to bring in the harvest before it rots in the fields, needs him, and William knows it. For the first time in his life, he has leverage. When the lord demands his service, William can do something unthinkable. He can refuse. He can demand higher wages, better conditions. He can threaten to leave and go to the neighboring manor, where another desperate lord will gladly pay his price. This small personal act of defiance, repeated in millions of variations across the continent, was an earthquake that shook the feudal pyramid to its core. The old system was built on a surplus of people and a scarcity of land. The plague had inverted that reality overnight. The lords and nobles, the ruling class, tried to fight back. They passed laws, like the Statute of Labourers in England, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbidding peasants from leaving their manors. But these laws were impossible to enforce. The economic reality was more powerful than any king's decree. The serfs, sensing their newfound freedom, simply ignored them. They became mobile, moving to where the wages were highest, transforming themselves from property into a free-willed wage-earning labor force. Serfdom, the bedrock of medieval society, was dying. This revolution rippled outwards, with fewer mouths to feed and higher wages in their pockets. The surviving commoners saw their standard of living rise dramatically. They ate better food, wore better clothes, and could afford small luxuries that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. Land that was once owned by families who had vanished was now available and cheap. A new class of prosperous yeoman farmers began to emerge, men who owned their own land and were beholden to no lord. The rigid three-tiered society of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work was becoming far more complex and fluid. A new confident middle class was on the rise. The landscape itself was remade, with fewer hands to work the land. Landowners had to make pragmatic choices. They abandoned labor-intensive crops like wheat and converted vast tracts of arable land into pasture for sheep, as raising livestock required far fewer people. This single shift would fuel the growth of England's wool trade, making it an economic powerhouse and changing the face of its countryside forever. The plague also spurred innovation. The labor shortage created a powerful incentive to find new, more efficient ways of doing things. It encouraged the development of labor-saving devices and technologies, from more efficient plows to early experiments with water and wind power. Humanity, faced with a deficit of muscle, was forced to rely more on its mind. Perhaps the most profound change, however, was in the mind itself. The survivors were a generation that had looked into the abyss. They had seen the fragility of life, the powerlessness of institutions, and the vanity of worldly ambition. This experience did not necessarily make them less faithful, but it did make their faith more personal, more direct, and less reliant on the dictates of a church that had failed to protect them. It also created a new, intense appreciation for the life they had almost lost. There was a shift in focus, away from a purely spiritual existence centered on the afterlife, towards a greater interest in the world of here and now. A new humanism was born, a fascination with the potential, the beauty, and the tragedy of human life on Earth. The Black Death was not the end of the world. It was the end of a world. It was the violent, agonizing death of the High Middle Ages. But in its wake it cleared the ground for something new to grow. The weakening of the old feudal order, the rise of individual worth, the questioning of religious authority, and the new focus on human experience. These were the fertile soil from which the Renaissance would spring. The great flowering of art, science, and philosophy that was to come was not born in spite of the plague, but in many ways because of it. The survivors, standing amidst the ruins of their former world, were about to build a new one. The fire has burned low, traveler, and the shadows in this room have grown long. Our journey is at an end. We have walked together through a world of unimaginable horror, a world emptied by a silent and invisible enemy. We have stood in the shadow of the plague doctor, listened to the prayers of the flagellants, and felt the profound silence of an abandoned world. And now, we return. The story of the Black Death is not just a chronicle of death. To remember it, only for its mountains of corpses, is to miss its most profound and enduring lesson. It is a story about the complete and total collapse of a world, and the astonishing, unpredictable, and ultimately beautiful nature of what grew in its place. It is a testament to the fact that endings, even the most violent and agonizing ones, are also, always, beginnings. A wound so deep does not simply heal, it reshapes the body, and the plague was a wound on the soul of the world. The society that emerged from it was scarred and traumatized, but it was also more resilient, more dynamic, and possessed of a strange new freedom. The survivors, having stared into the void, were filled with a fierce appreciation for the preciousness of life itself. The rigid certainties that had defined their existence for 1,000 years had been proven to be illusions, and in that shattering, a space was created for new questions, new art, new science, and a new understanding of what it means to be human. The echoes of that great silence still resonate today. They are in the very fabric of our modern world, in the foundations of our economic systems, in the roots of our individual liberties, in the persistent human drive to understand and conquer disease. It serves as a humbling, eternal reminder of our own fragility. It reminds us that our complex, glittering, and seemingly indestructible civilization is like theirs, a delicate web, vulnerable to forces far beyond our control. But more than anything, the story of the Black Death is a story about us. The clothes change, the languages shift, the beliefs transform, but the human heart in a time of crisis remains hauntingly the same. We saw in them our own capacity for fear, for blame, for hatred, but we also saw our own capacity for immense courage, for selfless compassion, for unshakable resilience, and for the stubborn, irrational hope that drives us to rebuild, to innovate, and to endure. The tale is told, the past can now be left to its slumber. May you take from this story not a sense of dread, but a deeper appreciation for the simple, profound peace of your own world. May the air you breathe feel a little cleaner, the warmth of your home a little more precious. Thank you for sharing the firelight with me tonight, for listening to these echoes from a time long past. The night is quiet now. It is time for you to rest. May your sleep be deep and untroubled, and may you awaken to a world filled with light. Good night, traveler.